In past years, every nation in Genshin felt like a long-anticipated sequel to a beloved series. The plan had been in place since before the game released, with speculation sparked by the Travail trailer along with countless hints and teasers scattered through Teyvat. Each region brought something fresh, something different, and for each one, while some were underwhelmed, many found that this new nation was the one which truly spoke to them. But over time, it became clear to Hoyo that the story they were trying to tell through veiled references and hidden lore was lost on those who chose to focus on the main experience, which seems to be the vast majority of players. That was fine when the lore was just extra depth put there for those who care, but now that we are approaching the endgame, that lore would be important. Their past approach was not enough, and so the plan was broken, a new region interjected. Hoyo hoped that with Not Cry, they could change their storytelling methods and weave together those threads that had been too sparse for most to grasp. While many were happy to hear Hoyo address these flaws directly and share their intent to fix them, others were concerned. A change of plans so late could lead to rushed and mediocre content, or just a bunch of filler, and the story was far from Genshin's only problem in the first place. At the very least, it was exciting to know that things could be different this time around. So, with Not Cry's first patch almost over, how is all this working out so far? With each new Genshin region, I find myself soaking up the atmosphere for a little while at first before I dive into the rest of the content. This time around, that was even more the case than usual. As I shared in my previous video, a couple of months ago I suffered a personal loss which affected me deeply. I was feeling very much adrift and was in no state to lock in and pay attention to any kind of action-packed or involved story. Instead, what I needed was something more relaxed, a calm and cozy cove where I could find shelter from the storms of life. Fortunately, Not Cry hit that spot for me. The landscapes are gorgeous, the music is ethereal, and many of the new ideas they've built into the world this time around made it all feel more alive than previous regions. That last point became more obvious over time, but one thing which was front and center from the first moment was that Not Cry is a land of contrasts. Each of the 3 islands so far have wildly different atmospheres. Heezy Island is high fantasy at its best, with alien landscapes of otherworldly beauty strewn with ruins weathered by the winds of time. Lempo Isle embodies a haphazard frontier town mentality, its nature spoiled by jarring steampunk trash strewn across the land. And Paha Isle is the first unequivocally high-tech location in the game, its entire landscape subjugated by industry. There's an interesting parallel here, which comes with a huge divergence on a critical point. Not Cry echoes Fontaine with its juxtaposition of untouched nature against steampunk-themed industry. Nasha Town's aesthetics in particular remind me so much of Poisson. One of my disappointments with Fontaine was that the world itself seemed to emphasize the stark divide between the rich and the poor, but it was never brought to relevance in the main storyline. It was like an unfired Chekhov's gun, a pointed hint at a fascinating source of future conflict which was then abandoned without a trace. In Not Cry, Hoyo seemed to have finally learned this lesson. The fundamental conflicts and questions which are hinted at by the design of the world itself are central to the themes of the main story, and it all feels so much richer for it. One thing I didn't expect was that my feelings about Heezy Island and Lempo Isle would change a lot in a very short time. Heezy Island reminded me of Enkonomiya, one of the most beautiful parts of the game, and one I always felt was left criminally underused. Meanwhile, Lempo Isle looked like a bit of a dump in comparison, especially Nasha Town and the Kromkake craft shop. At first, it was very clear to me which one of the 2 I wanted to explore, but when I got around to playing the story, this began to change. Heezy Island is stunning, but the lush and gorgeous moonlit forest which make up the backdrop to Lauma's part in the story make the overworld feel a little too barren in comparison. I can't help but imagine how much more magical it would have been if at least parts of the island had taken that concept and run with it instead. And Nasha Town might be a bit ugly, but after spending time there, I can't help but love the place. The vibes are great, especially that one song which plays at night, but the collective personality of the jumbled and diverse community you meet there make it really shine. And similarly, Aino and Inefa make the craft shop feel like home. But of course, more on that later. On the other hand, when it comes to Paha Isle, my feelings have remained unchanged. The Experimental Design Bureau is exactly the kind of aesthetic I had always expected from the Fatui, an inevitable extension of the technological design language which had been evident in their weapons and outfits since the very start of the game. And the bold and brutal disregard for the natural world is so fitting for their worldview. The design speaks of conflict between the natural world of magic and the technological progress which seeks to exploit it, which is a perfect backdrop for the story they've been telling us so far in this new region. As I've said many times before, Genshin has always blended ideas from high fantasy with science fiction. When those genres and aesthetics are put together in a way which complement each other, you can have the best of both worlds. The most immediate thing after the vibes for me was of course the exploration experience. I've been very curious to see how they'd handle this. Up until Natlan, I had always felt that Genshin's traversal mechanic showed a slow but steady improvement with every passing region, and the spirit carps in Travail hit a perfect balance between making the exploration feel both engaging and freeing. I always wished they would go back and add similar mechanics everywhere. Natlan took a completely different tack, and while I had my issues with the first patch of Natlan's exploration content, Och Natlan and the Sacred Mountain were both a joy to experience. Travail still tops the list for me, but those two regions really did come close. Notcry's Kuhenki mechanics don't feel too bad for me, but they don't quite reach the same heights. It feels like a step backwards that you can't change altitude, and the rules around the distance you can travel and what interactions you can perform while inhabiting a Kuhenki seem sketchy and ill-defined to me, though that's largely because the controls themselves are oddly unintuitive. The moon lanes feel great for the most part, but they still have some edges where they could have been better. For example, it feels jarring that you lose your speed when switching lanes, and I suspect it would have felt far more fun if your momentum had been maintained. But despite my minor complaints about the traversal, there's something about wandering through Notcry which just flat out works for me. Sometimes, exploration games can evoke a powerful curiosity about what might be hiding around each corner, which transforms even the most mundane act of walking from place to place into something which feels compelling. I've mentioned it many times before, but the perfect example of this, which many can relate to, is that first moment when you spot Dragonspine on Mondstadt's horizon, and it sparks that wanderlust in you. Most people want to climb it just because it's there. Internal motivation, driven by some deep desire which can barely be expressed in words. For me, Notcry kindles a quieter, more subtle echo of that feeling. A simple wish to wander through the landscape and soak up its serenity. Maybe it's the headspace I've been in, but so far Notcry has been exactly what I needed. And it's a similar story when it comes to Notcry's puzzles. The ones where you need to use the Kuvaki feel janky and unpolished. I've often struggled to get them to trigger correctly, since if you take even a single step too far in any direction, it suddenly loses its connection. They're very finicky, they're unintuitive and poorly explained, and it can get frustrating. But despite the jank, on the whole, I've enjoyed them all a ton. There are several types which stand out as particularly fun, especially the mirror ones, some of which were more interesting than any other puzzles Genshin has had for years, though I still think they could do with adding some which are a lot more difficult. Overall, they've been just right for my headspace, a chill experience with just enough there to feel engaging despite the lack of challenge. One thing I do find kinda interesting is that the puzzles are completely divorced from the elemental system. Throughout much of Teyvat, there are many puzzles whose solutions rely on characters interacting with the world using the powers granted to them by their visions. This added a connection between the combat and the exploration, which made it feel like the characters you use truly integrated with the world. But it also led to a really irritating problem. If you didn't happen to have a character with the right element in your team, it was a pain to swap one in, and in many regions this was a constant irritant since they used puzzles which each required different elements even in a small area. It's been a positive that almost all of Notcry's puzzles ignore your elements entirely, since it means that you can just run around with whatever team you want and still collect all the things. Still, I think that the elemental puzzle problem could have been solved by allowing the Traveler to switch elements at will outside of battle, so that they could become the perfect overworld unit. But unless they give us something like that, on balance it's better to explore without that constant jarring need to switch teams. And it's also worth highlighting the updated treasure compass. My take on this has confused people in the past. The tools and abilities available to the player influence the design philosophy of the game. It takes a lot of time, effort, and skill to create an engaging open world. When done right, each point of interest is placed with intent, and for the more hidden ones, devs also add subtle visual cues to the world which players pick up on subconsciously, which guide them towards those obscure secrets. This makes players feel like they're an explorer, discovering the world. When the player can click a button to mark all nearby collectibles on their map, it changes the balance of trade-offs the developers need to make. They now have the temptation of the easy road. They could scatter points of interest at random without care for whether their placement makes sense, and without adding any of those subtle hints. After all, the players are going to find them all anyway. For people who want that exploration experience and don't ever click that button, the experience can end up less engaging as a result. Not Cry's treasure compass does let the player click a button to mark everything on the map, but it only does this after they've already found 90% of the points of interest in that area. This is a fantastic way to balance it. It means that placement and hints are just as vital, and the incentive for the devs to invest the time in creating an engaging experience remain in place. But it eliminates the pain of wandering through the mostly empty lands trying to find those last few things you missed the first time around. For the longest time, I've enjoyed Genshin's story, loved some specific moments and some characters' journeys, but felt that there was so much untapped potential that they could so easily unlock. I have entire videos exploring the things I wish they would approach differently, some highlighting major disappointments, others praising times they got things right, and others looking from a more general perspective. In the lead up to Not Cry, Hoyo acknowledged many of these issues and set out ideas for how they planned to fix them. The expectations I took from what they said were three main threads. First, it seemed important to them that Not Cry would be a melting pot with tons of different factions all crammed together and competing for influence, which would be woven into a cohesive narrative. Second, they wanted the stories to feel more organic, more integrated into the world itself and the day-to-day experience of playing the game, and less starkly disconnected from the other narratives at play. And third, they wanted this organic feeling to be mirrored in all the smaller details too, even down to having the world react to the characters you have on your team in unique ways. It all sounded great. And yet, apparently, deep down, I did not believe it would change at all. Not Cry is far from perfect, but the step up in quality feels huge, and every step along the way I've been surprised and delighted with the changes they've made. Those three things they talked about the most do have a large part to play, but it's all the other more subtle improvements which stand out the most to me. Things like the quality of the writing, the dialogue, the use of subtext, the environmental storytelling. They're still not perfect by any means, but they're very much improved. Most importantly, the characters have more facets to them, different sides to their personalities which clash and contradict one another, and make them feel messy and layered and more human, and their relationships feel more complex as a result. And don't get me wrong, these things did exist in the game before. The difference is that when they got it right in the past, it stood out because it wasn't the norm. In Not Cry, it's everywhere. A perfect example of how different this all is, which stood out to me, was an optional conversation with Dory early on in Nasha Town. I'd been wondering how they would introduce the various factions of Not Cry in-game. There are many of them, each with different goals, and I was kinda dreading the usual long-winded yapfest where some NPC would just dump a ton of info in our heads to get us up to speed. And when I spotted Dory, I expected just another slapstick conversation about her obsession with Mora. Instead, we got a fantastic example of how to combine exposition, characterization, and engaging dialogue into one cohesive conversation. It makes sense that we would ask her for intel on what to expect in this new region, but instead of jokes followed by dry exposition, everything she says is heavily filtered through her personal perspective, and it makes it all come alive instead. She's curious about what secrets the Fatui are hiding in their mysterious facility. She dismisses the Frostmoon Scions because they're not materialistic and are uninterested in her wares. She's skeptical of the Lightkeepers because she cannot comprehend people volunteering to work for free. She wants you not to talk to the Curatorium of Secrets because she sees them as her competition and doesn't want to lose your business. Her perspective is heavily biased, but since you know that, you can see through it and find hints of what to expect, how these peoples differ, and how they relate to the world. After this, we get other conversations where we hear other biased perspectives on the different people, and we can of course go and meet them for ourselves. This is infinitely more engaging than just being told this group are like this, the other group are like that, and for the story to begin from there, and it adds depth to the character who is telling you about the world. The setup of the factions does a great job of making Not Cry feel more alive, and I've been impressed that Hoyo have managed to bring together so many different groups with tensions and competing goals, each working in their own self-interest, and built a cohesive set of cultures from these disparate parts, which can so convincingly work together when the situation truly demands it. The writing is still very wordy at times, but when it's approaching things like this, it doesn't feel like such a chore. One big change in focus, which I feel has negatives as well as positives, is that push for more organic immersion. It's another thing I've always asked for, and it's one of Not Cry's strongest points. I love that the characters actually exist in the world. It's simply delightful to be wandering around and to just randomly bump into a character you know and have a fun little interaction with them, which gives you a little insight into their life, or moves a part of their story forwards. It fits perfectly with the chill, relaxed pace that it feels like Not Cry wants you to take, and it's arguably arguably the biggest reason the entire region feels more alive to many than any part of the game before. But, of course, it's far from perfect. One thing I really hate is how often these interactions are forced upon you the moment you enter a specific area. This was bad enough in previous regions, and I always wonder exactly how many characters have died in the history of the game because people were jumping down from a cliff but got jerked into a cutscene before they could unfurl their wings. Please, Hoyo, just stop. Sometimes, someone might have a minute to quickly condense some resin before they have to step outside. Or maybe they spotted something interesting while exploring and want to go do that. Forcing them to stop and sit through some unrelated dialogue is not engaging, and it ruins both the thing they were trying to do and any enjoyment that the story could have brought. Notcry's ever-present snippets for story are a joy to experience when you're in the mood for them, but the way they're implemented sucks for the times you just want to focus on something else. Another detail which I kinda feel a little bit both ways about is the enforced delays between episodes in some of the content. As I mentioned earlier, I spent much of the past couple of months very much not in the right headspace to enjoy an Archon quest, so I left them fairly late. What I didn't realise is that there'd be a fair few stories which require waiting multiple real-world days before you could progress to the next chapter. I've only been able to do a couple of Columbina's stories because of this, and it kinda sucks how spaced out they are. I understand Hoyo's desire to force people to spread out the content. One of the biggest problems the game has is the feast and famine cycle, where people have tons to do whenever a new patch drops, but burn through it in no time at all, and then complain of boredom while they're waiting for the next one to come around. I wish this was a little more flexible somehow and put a little bit more control in the hands of the players. Another thing, which does help with immersion a ton, but has some drawbacks, is the set of new interactions which require you to have a specific character on your team for you to see them. The vast majority of these are simple nice-to-haves, which make a world more vibrant. It's been great to see the animals react to Lauma's presence, and the deer healing your party's HP and energy has been such a nice perk to have. However, from what people in my community have said, if you don't have Lauma, you're locked out of seeing Aino's final anecdote, which finishes the little story of her looking after a wounded deer. The penultimate anecdote hints that perhaps someone who can talk to animals would be able to help them communicate, and you get some extra dialogue if you bring Lauma to that conversation, which apparently unlocks the final section. It's really hard to prove whether this is true or not. It's possible that there's just some percentage chance that it will progress if you don't have her, or that there's just some bug with this rather than it being a deliberate choice, but if this is how it's supposed to be, then that really sucks. It's just one little anecdote for now, but it's exactly the kind of thing many were apprehensive about when they announced this feature. Despite those complaints, the vast majority of the time, the ways they've made things more organic has made the experience a joy. As I mentioned earlier, the characterization in Notcry feels like a step up from what we've had before. Take Lauma, for example. I adore the druid persona, and I'm even playing one in a D&D campaign right now. I was a little worried that Lauma would fall into one of two potential traps. One, where she would only embody her trope and nothing more, and end up feeling shallow as a result. The other, where they would subvert expectations too much and she'd diverge too far to really hit the spot for me. Instead, they absolutely nailed it. Her personality and aura are fantastic, the story they went with added depth and nuance to her perspective on the world, and her actions and decisions feel fitting in the context of her life. Religious characters going through a crisis of faith can be interesting, but they're so common that it's rare for any take on them to feel particularly fresh. In Lauma's case, they managed to find an interesting twist on it for me and tell that story really well. I even enjoyed the NPC they used as a foil to compare and contrast how others might react to the same situation. I should probably write an entire video on all that, since I could just go on and on. Flynn's was a little more subdued, but still very interesting while he was center stage, and all the other characters had their moments to shine as well. An unexpected favourite for me so far is Columbina. I didn't feel much about her either way based on Winter Night's Lazo, but every encounter with her is captivating and filled with such interesting pieces of the puzzle. Another thing I've mentioned previously is how the presentation of lore can affect how much people care about it. I personally love stories with interesting and intriguing lore. However, I just do not care about lore when it isn't connected to the main story. You'll find me reading countless novels, but I don't think I'd ever make my way through the Silmarillion. I get that for some people, the experience of digging through the books scattered throughout Teyvat and connecting up those obscure references to figure out a hidden narrative is the reason they love the game. While that's not for me, I do still think Hoyo should be putting in the effort to add that kind of thing, because it's clearly something they do well. But for the stuff which is going to matter, bringing it to the surface is important, and our captivating conversations with Columbina are a great example of how it can be tied into the immediate narrative. And there was an even bigger step up when it comes to the relationships between the characters. They got this right at times in the past, the Sumeru crew in particular were a highlight, but it's something I felt was missing since then, and even the best of the ones in the past were comparatively simple. The best example is Aino and Inefa, who have such a fascinating and vibrant dynamic. They could so easily have had a basic parent-child relationship in either direction and it would have worked fine. But instead we get this mix where there is no fixed power dynamic underpinning all of their interactions, and instead they both confidently take the initiative on different things and bicker and scold one another in different situations, and every moment of it feels true to each of their personalities. I like them both on their own, but together they're one of the best things about Not Cry so far, and I've loved every minute. And this is where the organic side of things really comes into its own. Inefa and Aina's relationship is explored in so many different little slices of life. The main story, event quests, world quests, anecdotes, reputation quests, and so on. Experiencing these a little at a time has made it even better. Kinda sucks for people who want to zoom through everything at a breakneck pace, but when taken at the intended, measured cadence, it all feels so well done. One change they made, which many were unsure about, was the merging of the character stories and the Archon quests. Some of the best quests in the game were character stories, and it is a little sad that we won't get that deeper exploration to complement the brief anecdotes and the more action-packed Archon quests. The Tribal Chronicles in Natlan moved a little in this direction, to mixed results, so I was slightly apprehensive. However, I've really enjoyed Not Cry's main story so far, and they did a fantastic job of balancing the needs of the wider narrative with the extra focus given to the central character. It meant the quests have so much going on. They don't skimp on showing the other characters, who all had their own moments and tons of fun interactions where they all play off each other. They keep the main story moving, they explore fascinating lore from different angles, and they dive deep into that one specific character. There were still times where the pacing felt a little slow, but the highs more than made up for the lows. This video is already a lot longer than I really intended, so I'll leave my thoughts on the contents of the quest for another time. But suffice to say that I'm absolutely sold on the direction so far. Some of the moments were just fantastic, and Revere seems like an actual intimidating villain who can be a true threat to our heroes. I really wish Hoyo would tell us how long a chunk of quest will be before we start it, so that I don't accidentally start an hour-long segment at 3 AM again, but I guess you win some, you lose some. So that experience did make me question why the hell Flynns talk so slowly. Outside of the storytelling, the other major thing worth touching on are the combat mechanics and new enemies and the quality of life upgrades and similar changes. So far, the lunar reactions have been pretty much exactly what I expected. They basically feel like a character-specific reaction mechanic, just like Nilo's bountiful blooms. I don't love that they're noticeably more powerful than the older characters, but mechanically speaking, they don't make a huge difference to how everything feels. I do still wish for characters who have more dynamic movements. So far, characters like Skirk still stand out a ton when compared to the average reaction DPS, but that's more of a tangent. When it comes to endgame, this does become an issue when you throw in enemies like the Wild Hunt, which shield the lunar mechanics, while also ratcheting up the DPS checked for anyone who doesn't happen to pull for those new characters. It's sad to see the variety of potential teams you could use against that content continue to narrow, but at the end of the day, 100 Primogems really doesn't make a difference. The level 100 thing has thankfully been a non-issue so far, especially since they adjusted the balance so that transformative reactions only gain a minor benefit from the level increase. Honestly, the biggest difference has actually been the artifact substat preview. Being able to see what the final line of the 3-stat artifact will be before you level it is such a game changer. Decisions become so much easier to make when you have that little extra piece of information. I don't know what I was expecting from Not Cry. Throughout Natlan, they made many improvements, and despite my bitter disappointment with several key aspects of the main story, much of that region showed promise. When they revealed Not Cry, they told us what they planned and highlighted specific things they were going to change. I covered all that in both my Natlan retrospective and my Not Cry expectations videos, and yet I still find myself so surprised to see that promise fulfilled, to see consistency and quality in the storytelling and characterization, to see the world building and the lore and the narrative woven together, and to have an experience where the flaws are vastly outweighed by the positives. It isn't flawless, it still has pacing issues, design issues, and so much room for improvement. It's just one patch so far, but it feels more than just one step in the right direction, and we can hope that this is just the start. Until next time.